You know, each child has different needs, and you want to make sure that the evaluation addresses those particular needs, and it does so in some different ways. Quick example. So with an evaluation, there may be curriculum-based assessments, what's happening in the classroom, that are used to assess a child. There may be standardized achievement testing. There may be cognitive testing. There may be rating scales. And we're going to talk about some of these in a little bit, but a variety of tests and assessments, so you have a good collection of information. That should be specified on the permission form. I would encourage you, for any of these special education documents, really get the document, take your time, read the document again. If you don't understand something on the document, it's okay, and certainly ask somebody about it. What does this mean? I'm a believer in looking at resources, and Christine and I, frequently look at good resources. One is the Patent website, where they have annotated IEPs and annotated forms. And if you're not sure what something in a form is, you can go to that, put the name in, do a search, and you'll find out. Look at the section, and it'll give you a description. Still on the permission to evaluate, the purpose is really to allow for an evaluation to determine whether or not your child is eligible, should your child receive special education services. And, in the work Christine and I do, and I've been doing special education work for about 25 years, we see some things that unfortunately are common problems or common issues. So we're going to give you some practical suggestions. One is, make your request for an evaluation in writing. It's essential that you do that. If you say to somebody, say to the teacher, you know what, I want my child evaluated, it may or may not be done. It may or may not get back to somebody who can then take the next step. Do it in writing, preferably by email, and then keep a copy for your records. I can tell you, in special ed cases where there's what we call a child find issue, was the child evaluated timely? Oftentimes we're looking at a request from a parent they sent by email that wasn't acted upon, but the parent has proof. Really important to do it by writing. Also, ensure that the school, and you're going to see LEA, you're going to see school, I'm going to say school tonight, but ensure that the school makes a decision on your request. They're required to respond to you within 10 days of your request. Hopefully it'll be sooner. They may give you another form that says, here, complete this, in which you formally request the evaluation, and you submit that. Keep a copy of that. But the bottom line is, they need to respond. If they don't respond to your request, you need to follow up with them and push them, because every day that goes by is a day where there's not a completed evaluation, and there's not eligibility. So really important to follow up. Ensure that the school completes the evaluation within 60 calendar days. That excludes the summer. Certainly, a school can conduct the evaluation in all or part of the summer. They're not required to by the regulations, but they can do that if they want, especially if there's a more urgent need. And then finally, ensure that the school assesses all areas of need. If you think your child has issues in writing and reading and math, and they say, you know what, we're going to do assessments of reading and of math, don't let them skip writing. If behavior is an issue, don't let them neglect behavior. Address it all, so you have what's called a comprehensive report. The next slide is agreement to waive a reevaluation. And we put this in here just almost as a kind of a thing to be aware of. We are not believers in waiving reevaluations. And the reevaluation is kind of the step after the initial evaluation report is completed. There's a subsequent obligation to reevaluate. This form proposes waiving a reevaluation of the student. Waiver cannot happen for a student whose identification is intellectual disability. That they must do a reevaluation of that student. But basically, waiving a reevaluation lets the school kind of off the hook in terms of getting updated information that may be really good information, really important information about your child. We see the benefits of a reevaluation, again, they have to be done every 3 years at least, as number one, having updated information about your child, updated information on progress, updated information on what the teachers and others are seeing in the school setting. It's also important because the person or persons who draft the reevaluation, it's not you, it's the school. So if you read the reevaluation, you're going to get a very good indication of how the school views your child, what they think is important, maybe some areas that they've targeted, maybe some areas they've overlooked, but you're going to have good information about your child, especially if they do the reevaluation correctly. And then third, and we'll cover this a little bit more in detail, the reevaluation will be just like an initial evaluation. That's going to be a critical document leading into your IEP meeting. It's going to help define needs. It's going to help define progress levels and independent skill levels. It's going to maybe make recommendations in terms of some programming or potentially placement. So our suggestion is do not waive a reevaluation.
Question for you, Scott.
Sure.
Would reevaluation consist generally of just a records review, or does it require the district or the LEA to do comprehensive testing?
So a reevaluation can be a review of records, but again, I'm going to get to it. I think we have two slides up. I would be very cautious with just a review of records for reasons I'll talk about. You want, think of the word comprehensive. So if you're talking initial evaluation for eligibility or a reevaluation, the more detail, the better. The more assessments generally, the better. The more information the IEP team has, the better. Review of records is much more limited. The next slide focuses on evaluation reports. And again, this is a topic, honestly, that we could spend the evening talking about. So I'm going to give you kind of key points here. If you look at the form evaluation, so just a blank evaluation report or the annotated report that is on the patent website, you're going to see reasons for referral. What's the reason for the evaluation? Was it a request by the parent? Was it a suggestion by the school district? Was it a combination? Was it information from an outside provider? They should have some description. And it's not just who made the request, it's what are they seeing? Is the child struggling in the general education curriculum? Is there some particular reason? And that's important. The second main area of an evaluation report is the sources of evaluation data. And that would be things like, standardized assessments or observations or information from teachers, any of the sources of information that go to the evaluation data and the evaluation process. The third kind of main area of evaluation reports is summary of findings. And if you look at the way it's written on the form, it says summary of findings / interpretations of evaluation results. And it's so important that with an initial evaluation and a reevaluation, you have not only the description of this is what we did, these are the assessments, this is what I saw in the observation, but also an interpretation of what the significance is. What does it mean? So I see that my child has a standard score of 85 in decoding. Well, what does that mean? And how does that translate to what the programming should be in the IEP? It's really important that the school psychologist is kind of the leader of providing that interpretation. There are others too that can provide interpretation, but it can't just be recitation. It has to be description, recitation, and then interpret the results. And then finally, in the evaluation report, you're going to have a conclusion section. So if you look at the last few pages, there'll be a page that has, does the child have a disability? And it'll be a check, a yes or no. And then if the child has a disability, should the child effectively be eligible for special education or not? And, the standard is ultimately, if the child has a disability, do they require specially designed instruction and special education programming to be able to participate in the general education curriculum and really make progress? You probably have heard of Section 504. Section 504 is a little bit different standard. You could have an initial evaluation where an evaluator assesses, number one, does the child have a disability? And says, well, yes, they do, but they may need just accommodations as opposed to specially designed instruction. So you may see an evaluation that addresses both. Special education eligibility is going to provide greater supports and greater resources, but they have to make that decision, that conclusion, determination of eligibility in the report. In terms of kind of things that are important on this slide, I'll skip over a few, but I mentioned interpretation. Hold the school accountable. Make sure that they give you interpretation. If they don't, and you're at a meeting reviewing this, ask them, what does this mean? What's the significance? How's this going to lead us, to properly program for our child? That's really important. And the next point leads to that, which is basically when reviewing the evaluation report, ask questions, get explanations from the evaluator, get explanations from the IEP team. That is part of the process here. And then finally, in terms of timing, just beware. Oftentimes we'll see a school issue an evaluation report, and they do that, and it's an initial, so it's the first, you're getting the information, and they'll say, your child's going to be eligible, so we're going to have an IEP meeting the same day. You have a right to get the the evaluation report, at least 10 days prior to the IEP occurring. You can waive that if you choose to, but the best practice is to get the report, have ample time to review, come prepared with questions. And if you need to reconvene the IEP team, a few days out or 10 days out, that's okay. The district may want to do it all, or the school may want to do it all together, but these are your rights. Just make sure that you know what the ER shows and that you're in a position to then step into the IEP meeting. The next slide is reevaluation reports. So once again, for a reevaluation to occur, a child's already been found eligible, and we're probably close to 2 to 3 years out from the initial evaluation and eligibility. And in terms of reevaluation, similar in terms of content, needs to be comprehensive. Again, as Benita mentioned, it can be a review of records, but I would just really caution you if you're in a situation where your school says, we're just going to do a review of records, because in our experience, we've seen schools simply take records, kind of just regurgitate the information in the records, put that in the reevaluation report, oftentimes lack that interpretation, that analysis. And the goal is to have a more comprehensive evaluation. So even if let's say there's an initial evaluation and 3 years later, there's a reevaluation. In the initial, they did cognitive testing and they did achievement testing. And let's say between the two timeframes, there's some behaviors that have happened in school that in that reevaluation, maybe you don't need cognitive testing, but having standardized achievement testing so you can see, did your child make progress from point A to point B? And then having perhaps rating scales being completed by the teacher on the behaviors and the parent, and maybe an observation in the school setting by someone, and then discussing all those things. That's much better than a review of records report. So I would encourage you just to be real cautious about review of records, and then ask questions, get explanations from the evaluator, get explanations from the IEP team. These documents are really important documents that will lead to programming decisions, content, placement decisions, and it's so important that they're done properly. Hold the schools accountable to make sure they do these properly. We're going to rotate back and forth, so I'm going to turn it over to Christine now to talk about rating scales.
Sure. So when a school is evaluating or reevaluating your child, you may see rating scales come to you from the school's evaluator, and they may ask you to complete them. And rating scales are just standardized questionnaires that are completed by teachers, by parents, and by others regarding observations of a child. And they're basically based on your own observations of your child in the home setting, including behaviors you might be seeing, social emotional skills, and other areas. And so these rating scales will assist with screening for certain diagnosing a number of disabilities, including ADHD, emotional and behavioral disorders, autism, intellectual disability, and other conditions. And depending on which rating scale you're being provided by the evaluator, they might ask you to rate how often you see your child engaging in a particular behavior or expressing certain feelings. They may ask you to quantify the severity of the behaviors or symptoms. And you would just go through each item of the questionnaire and have to rate how often you might be seeing a particular behavior by never, sometimes, often, always, or other scales are used depending on what the rating scale is provided to you. On this slide, we have listed a few of the types of rating scales that you might that we see school districts and charter schools use most often that you might be asked to complete as a parent. This list is by no means exhaustive. There are many different rating scales out there that are not listed here. The one at the top that you might be familiar with, and we see a lot, is the behavior assessment system for children, the BASC, and that is a popular rating scale that's used that assesses a wide variety of behaviors. The brief, that last one at the bottom, the behavior rating inventory of executive functions, that we see used a lot, and that's a rating scale of executive functioning in school-age children. So important points to remember if you are provided with rating scales to fill out as part of an evaluation or reevaluation. You want to do your best to take the time to fill out each and every item. We don't want to skip any. We don't want to leave any blank. We want to give the school psychologist a full data set so that they can interpret both your scores, the teacher scores, and anyone else that filled out the rating scales, and include them in your reevaluation report. If you do not return the rating scales, we often see evaluators that will note that in the report that the parent was sent rating scales and did not return them. That often can be construed as the parent not cooperating in the evaluation process. And that's something that a hearing officer down the road looking at an evaluation or reevaluation report might not look too fondly on, as they have to make determinations as to whether a parent is cooperative in the process. Also, when filling out the rating scales, you want to be as accurate as possible. You do not want to overestimate the capabilities or skills of your child, and you don't want to underestimate them either. If your child can perform a certain skill on their own, rate them that way, say so. If they cannot, also rate them that way. If they cannot do it independently, then you do not want to estimate or overestimate their capabilities or skills. We want an accurate picture of how your child is currently functioning, and we want to give enough information to the school psychologist to use in the report.
Question for you, Christine. On some occasions, should parents always receive a rating scale as well? So if the school is going to do, say, the BASC, is there a parent rating scale that should be sent to the parents as well?
Sure. So depending on the rating scale, the BASC actually has a teacher rating, a parent rating, and I believe they also have a rating scale for the students themselves. Yes, in order to have a comprehensive evaluation, you would want scales across all settings, the home, the school, and any type of self-report, if that's what the rating scale provides. That certainly is useful information, and would, when you compare the results from the teacher and the parents, if you're seeing it across settings, that validates some of the results and what behaviors we're seeing across settings and we want to program for.
Thank you.
The next slide is the parent input form. Some schools actually have a standard form that they may call the parent input form. We will often see it when a permission to evaluate or a permission to reevaluate consent form goes out. It's sometimes paired with it. And the purpose of this form is to gather parent information either in the evaluation process or also prior to an IEP meeting in order to assist the IEP team in developing the IEP. Just some important points to be aware of. If your school does send you this pre-printed form and they have a list of questions that they send to basically all students that are being evaluated, you certainly should fill out the form to the best of your ability. It may be a good template that addresses areas of need that you might not have considered as potentially being areas of concern. So definitely fill that out and return it. But remember that you as parents are not limited to those pre-printed forms, and that you can provide any parent input that you would like in the evaluation process. So it could be anything that you think is relevant to the evaluation or your child's educational needs or programming. It could be private evaluations. You could provide background information about your child's developmental history, any medical diagnoses if you choose to share that with the school, and any other information or factors that you think the IEP team should be aware of. During the IEP meeting itself, you will have another opportunity to share your parent concerns. There should be a discussion at the IEP meeting about those concerns and enhancing your child's education. And that should be reflected in the parental concern section of the IEP. I would just beware of some of the traps that we see, particularly some school districts after the IEP meeting may put statements in the parental concern section that sometimes are self-serving, I would say, that they pick out statements made by the parents at the IEP meeting that maybe they were happy with progress made in one area, or they were happy to see how their child was doing this school year, but they ignore the parental concerns in other areas that were discussed at the IEP meeting. So after the IEP meeting, when a final IEP is issued, I urge you to go back to the IEP in the parental concern section, make sure it's not blank, because sometimes the IEP team does not go back and fill that in after the meeting. And also, if information is included in the parental concern section, make sure it accurately reflects what was discussed at the IEP meeting. If it does not, or it is blank, you have the option of presenting or submitting written parental concerns, and you can ask the IEP team to just copy and paste it and put it in the parental concern section. Or you can even on the NORUP that's issued with the IEP, you can just note your concerns in writing on that NORUP. The next educational record is the invitation to participate in IEP team meeting. This is a form that schools use. It should be issued in advance of an IEP meeting, and it would invite the parents and student if the student turns 14 years old during the IEP term or is older. And it's a meeting to discuss the special education programs and services for the student. The invitation to participate should state the purpose of the meeting, whether it's to develop an IEP, to revise an IEP, if transition services are going to be discussed, or post-secondary goals. There's also an other box on the form where the IEP team can fill in any reason that the IEP team is meeting. What we're seeing a lot, being that the IEP team meetings are virtual, are that sometimes the school is scheduling meetings via just an Outlook calendar invite, or via just a phone call to the parent, or via email. You want to make sure if that does occur, you still want to follow up with the school and request a copy of this invitation, because the invitation not only has the date and time and location of the meeting, but it also would include a list of who is invited as far as the team members of the IEP team. So it will give you an awareness of who's going to be present. You should know who is required to be a team member for an IEP meeting, and there's a list that the law provides required team members. The parents of the child are required not less than one regular education teacher of the child if the child is or may be participating in the regular education environment. Not less than one special education teacher of the child, a representative of the LEA or the school. So that could be a director of special education, a principal, it could be a special education supervisor, anyone that's knowledgeable about the available resources of the school district or the charter school, and actually has the authority to commit those resources. Many times we're in IEP meetings and the right decision makers aren't in the room. And we often have to deal with phone calls being made to those that aren't there. So it's important that the LEA that is at the IEP meeting really have some authority to make some decisions. Also a required team member is any individual who can interpret the instructional implications of the evaluation results. And that person may already be a team member that's there. So it could be a special education supervisor that can talk about those instructional implications. The child with the disability of 14 or older is also invited to the IEP meeting and a required participant. They can participate in all or a portion of the IEP meeting, or under other circumstances, it may be appropriate to invite the child as well. And then you as a parent, you have the right to invite anyone that you want who has knowledge or special expertise regarding your child. So that could be an educational advocate, that could be a related services personnel, that could be private evaluators. But you should definitely let the school know ahead of time who you plan on bringing with you. And if it's an attorney, you definitely should, because they would need to have their attorney present as well. If transition services are going to be discussed, the LEA must also invite a representative from other public agency who may be providing those services or paying for them. And that's usually OVR. So as far as the invitation is concerned, the school must take reasonable steps to ensure that one or both of the parents are there. They should notify the parents of the meeting in enough time to ensure they will have an opportunity to attend. So we often tell our clients, if you know your annual IEP meeting is coming up, let's say it's November 26th, today is October 26th, we're about 30 days out. You haven't heard from the school as far as scheduling the IEP meeting, just be proactive, reach out to the school and say, let's get some dates and times to get this IEP meeting scheduled. And that just, it benefits everyone, because hopefully that's enough time that everyone could get it on their schedules. The LEA is required to schedule at a mutually agreeable time. And so if you have like a work situation that you're not able to attend, or you wouldn't be able to participate, proactively let the school know and provide like alternative times and dates that you would be available and able to participate.
So I have a question for you real
Yes.
quick. Can an LEA say at an IEP meeting, like, you know what, I really don't know, I'm going to have to get back to you on that?
It happens. It depends on the situation. I would say it does happen at times. And it would just depend on the circumstances.
Yeah, let me add in. Sure. I mean, it depends on the question, but you may be asking about programming or a staffing issue where they have to do some out of meeting analysis and get back to you. Just make sure they get back to you. And the get back part, Benita, might involve, depending on the issue, it might involve, hey, we need to have the IP team together to talk about that issue after the answer is given. But there's a lot that they should know and not say that.
So the next slide is the parental consent to excuse members from attending an IEP meeting. This is often sent along with the invitation. And this is just a form that gives the school the opportunity to ask the parent to excuse a required member of the IEP team for a particular meeting that's being scheduled, whether it's in whole or in part. Important points to note, as a parent, it's completely up to you. It's your decision whether to excuse a required member from the IEP team meeting. It's not automatic. Just because they send you this form doesn't mean you have to sign it and agree to it. We do advise our clients never to agree to excusing an LEA or a special education teacher. And then you may also want to consider not excusing a regular education teacher, at least entirely from the IEP meeting, because they might have very valuable input in if your child is participating in a regular education environment and they might have to implement some accommodations in the classroom, they would provide behavior supports. And so supports for school personnel may be necessary. So their attendance throughout the IEP meeting, it may be required in order to determine a lot of these program issues. But in reality, it often comes up when we're at an IEP meeting. Somebody finishes their portion. It might be the physical therapist. They've gone over updated progress monitoring. They've gone over the proposed goals. They've gone over the proposed SCI and services, and they're really not implementing much more of the IEP. Certainly in certain circumstances, you can excuse those type of IEP team members. If it's a critical role in the IEP team, such as the special education teacher, you certainly do not want to excuse them. And if they do have to leave in the midst of an IEP meeting, you might want to reconsider or consider reconvening the IEP meeting when she can return, he or she can return.
Right, next up is individualized education program, obviously IEP. Critical topic, also an extremely broad topic. I expect in future parent trainings we'll take this on in some greater detail, but there's some key points I want to just emphasize. One is encourage everybody to review that annotated IEP. Take a look at that, read the descriptions. That will really help you understand what the sections are for, the purpose of the section, type of information to be included in the section. There's a link on this slide to that, and it's pretty easy to find. In doing this special education work, I used to be a believer that the most important part of the IEP was the educational needs section, because it's so important to have the needs identified, have them identified specifically, not reading, but decoding and reading comprehension. And to, they're there in the IEP. And then do we have a goal that corresponds to that? Do we have SDI that corresponds to that? What's the placement where that can be provided? I still believe that needs is a critical area, but present education levels combined with needs is going to drive your IEP programming if you do it right. So the school has an obligation to gather information and put that relevant, important, fairly recent information into the present ed levels, PEL. That's in the early part of the IEP. The present ed levels, think of it as simply as, it's the story or part of the story or the chapter about your child's education. The present education levels, if they're done properly, should have a bridge or be a bridge between the most recent IEP and the current IEP you're working on. Think about the most recent IEP. You have the one from last school year. You have goals in particular area. You have expected levels of achievement. Well, in the present education levels, the school needs to report, this is what the goal was. Here's what the progress or lack of progress on the goal was. Here's what worked. Here's the instruction we used. All important detail. And if they do that, that's forcing the school team to think about, this worked, it did not work, we should continue it. We should adjust this goal, adjust the expected level of achievement. There's a lot of takeaways if you include the proper information in the present ed levels. The IEP itself, so we're working on a current IEP, you're at a meeting, all of the sections of the IEP are interrelated. So think about that. Progress reporting in your present ed levels. And then how does that translate to, did your child master this goal? Maybe the goal is no longer needed. Did your child achieve the expected level of achievement so we can keep the goal, but adjust that? Are there tools in the SDI, instructional tools that really work well that we want to keep? Are there ones that aren't used, the ones that don't work, ones that cause the child to have behaviors? So all of those kind of the interrelation between what happened and what's going to happen through the current IEP, it all goes together. So interrelationship between past and current, and interrelationship between the sections of your current IEP. Think about that. That will help make for a better IEP. The IEP, you've heard this phrase, I'm sure, before, but it's the contract. It's the agreement between the school and you. And we see many times well-written IEPs where there are implementation failures, meaning district says or the school says, this is what's in the IEP, we're going to do this, and they don't do it, or they don't do it right, or they don't do it consistently. But it's so important to have the right content in the IEP, because that is the written, so to speak, contract between you and the school. And the other thing Christine and I hear is schools say, well, you know what, what you're talking about at the meeting, it's a best practice. We all do that. We even do that in general education. So we don't need to include that in the IEP. And I think the opposite. If you're doing it and it's important to the child, put it in the IEP, list it, and then everybody who reads the IEP knows it's in there and knows you have to do it. I want to add a couple comments to some of what Benita and Christine mentioned. One is, if you have an IEP and somebody needs to leave, you think about reconvening, but also sometimes we see, you go to an IEP meeting, they say, well, we have an hour slotted for this IEP, and you may have some very involved issues. Maybe you have a reevaluation report and you're not going to get everything finished in an hour. It's okay to use that hour, but think about, do we reconvene next week or 2 weeks from now? Because it's better to do it properly, take the time and have a good product instead of rushing and having a product or having an IEP that's not going to be comprehensive. The we may mention the concept of extended school year tonight, but I do want to just say up front, extended school year is something that each child who has an IEP may be entitled to. It's imperative that the school team consider whether or not a child should receive ESY in the upcoming summer. There are factors related to ESY that must be applied. They're in the regulations in Pennsylvania. And it's not just regression. There's some other factors that are important, but that needs to be discussed. And I think schools should err on the side of providing ESY for a lot of different reasons. Number one, it benefits the child. And then finally, to supplement what Christine said about parental concerns, again, important. You may agree with 80% of the IEP, but basically, if you have concerns about other aspects, write them down. Ask the district team to include them in the parental concerns section. That's your language, not theirs. So make sure what you feel, what you believe is noted in and that's a good investment of your time. They can note that in the IEP. The next slide is notice of recommended educational placement. So we have 3 slides on this. It's the NORP. The NORP is a document that is really confirmation of what the school's proposal is, the school's recommendations related to the child's educational program. There's a host of different actions that a school may take, and we're going to get to another slide that has them all listed. If you look at the NORP document, you will see it's typically a 4-page document, and you'll see description of what's being proposed. You'll see a consideration of other things that were could be other areas, other placements, other options that were considered but not selected by the district. And then you'll see at the end, approve, disapprove, and then your procedural rights. So the NORP does require you to approve or disapprove. You're under a time limitation, which we'll get to in a second. But the NORP is a really important document. It goes with the IEP. The next slide still relates to NORPs. And I took this language, Christine and I took this language directly from a form NORP. So you can see that the NORP says this is to notify you of the school's action regarding your child's program. Then they have a host of different actions, and it covers a lot. It doesn't cover everything, but covers a lot. I want to hit a few of these. One is the first bullet, proposes initial provision of special education and related services. So if there's initial evaluation and initial eligibility, the school can't provide special education unless you consent to that. And the way you consent to that is through a NORP. You check that you approve. If you do not approve, the school cannot go forward and provide special education. The second bullet is refusal to initiate evaluation. Remember a few slides ago, we talked about, I'm asking for an initial evaluation. And if the school says, you know what, we think your child doesn't need one, we don't think your child has a disability, we think your child is doing fine in general education, then they're saying we're not going to evaluate. So that will force you to then make a decision of how you're going to proceed. But at least they're getting them locked in to say, you asked and we're refusing. A few entries down, change of placement for disciplinary reasons. Christine and I find that with discipline, it usually happens fast. It's usually confusing because the school tends not to tell the parents much of what's happening. Many of the things happen in school in terms of the event itself, discipline, interviews by the principal, things like that. But if there is a change of placement, meaning an exclusion of a child for could be 10 days, it could be 15 days, depending on the situation, it could be longer actually, then that has to be identified through a statement, and the form of statement is through a NORP. Graduation from high school and exiting special education both require NORP. Point being, there's clarity. If your special education is going to terminate under either, everybody needs to know that's the decision, that's the recommendation, and there's agreement or disagreement. ESY is offered through a NORP. And you may have a NORP that's specific only to ESY, but it has to give enough detail so you know what the offer is and you can make a decision. And then finally, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about this during this presentation, but an important topic, response to requests for an independent educational evaluation at public expense. If you disagree with a district evaluation or reevaluation, and you've asked the school district or the school to fund, they pay for a private evaluation by an evaluator you choose, and the school says no, they should issue a NORUP and say, we're not going to do it. And there's some triggers to some procedural rights related to that in that event. The next slide focuses on approval and disapproval. So we titled this parental consent. I'm going to give you the key points here to think about. Number one is that once the NORUP is sent to you, and it should be accompanied, if it's IEP related, it should be accompanied by the IEP, the current IEP. You're going to have to read what they send you and then make a decision, and you should make a decision within 10 days of receipt. Am I going to approve or am I not going to approve? And if I'm not going to approve, what procedural rights do I want to utilize? Do I want an informal meeting? Do I want to request mediation with ODR? Do I want to request a due process hearing? That's what you need to think about. So when you get the form, you're going to be asked to sign the form. You're going to be asked to return the signed NORUP within 10 calendar days of your receipt back to the school. You should keep a copy of whatever you sign and send back to them. If you don't complete and return the form within 10 days, in many situations, the school has the ability to simply proceed and implement after those 10 days what they have proposed. So quick example, if there's a IEP and you had your annual IEP meeting, they added some goals, and maybe they added some SDI, and maybe they did some things you don't agree with. If they send you that IEP and the NORUP and you don't get back to them within 10 days, the school should implement that IEP, presuming it's not a change of placement. And you can certainly say, school, I don't agree with that later. You can certainly say, school, that's not an offer of an appropriate education, but they will implement. When if you see the third kind of box down, it says, I do not approve the action recommendation, and my reason for disapproval is, I see many situations where parents may agree with much of the IEP and NORUP, but you don't agree with everything. And you have to really think about, am I going to say I agree when I don't agree with everything? When in many situations, you can just check I disapprove, and you can hand right in there, I agree with whatever it is, or I don't agree with whatever you want to specify. It's okay to do that. It's okay to be specific, and I'd encourage that. But just be careful, because in some situations, if you don't request due process and you don't request mediation, then the school is going to go forward and they're going to implement the action or recommendation. And that may be something that you don't want. Matters right now, I can think of two where we're battling schools where there were issues about return of a NORUP or what was said in the NORUP, and the school is trying to force a change of placement, and we think they're legally incorrect, but we're now in a dispute about that issue. So NORUPs, just beware of the 10 days, beware of the content, and best practices to complete it, get it back, and keep a copy.
Okay, the next slide is progress monitoring, which is a critical educational record for your child's education. So each student with an IEP has specific goals and objectives to accomplish within the IEP term of a school year, and they address that student's individual needs. As your child is working toward meeting those goals, there are members of the IEP team, like the case manager, special education teacher, related service provider, that will regularly conduct ongoing progress monitoring of how your child is doing and performing on those goals. They do this by using short tests or asking the child to complete a task independently. There are curriculum-based assessments. There are different progress monitoring tools. And then the school is required to issue a IEP progress report, which should provide detailed information about your child's progress. Under the law, you should receive IEP progress reports at least as often as students without disabilities receive their report card. So typically it's going to be 3 to 4 times per school year, but the IEP team can always agree in the IEP to report progress on goals more often. So we see that a lot of times in behaviors. If there's a behavioral goal that is potentially new and addressing a behavior of concern, and the IEP team is implementing a new behavioral intervention or positive behavior support plan, the IEP team might agree to report progress more often, maybe every 2 weeks or monthly, to the parent, so that they can address or monitor how effective those behavioral strategies really are in addressing that behavior. So you want to just review your IEP. If you look in the goals section, you can confirm, it says right next to the goal, and each goal is different, how often you should expect to receive your child's IEP progress report related to that goal, and how your child's progress in each of those goals will be measured, and how often and when the school will provide you that report. When you're reviewing the IEP progress report, schools can report on different goals in different ways. Sometimes you may see a graph showing each data point with what has been measured over time. Some schools provide just percentages with no description of what it is that the child is doing with respect to the goals. Some schools provide just written notes about your child's progress. You want to review those IEP progress reports with the goal in mind, the baseline in mind, and the target, and you want to compare reporting over different progress reporting periods. Beware of a school statement that just blanket says that a child is making satisfactory progress, but the actual data being reported doesn't support it. And so you want to just review those progress monitoring that is provided to you to really determine whether your child is making meaningful progress toward or expected progress toward the target at the end of the IEP term. If you have any questions about the data that's being provided, you can always ask what it means. You can email the school, you can ask follow-up questions, you can request raw data if you need it. But if you can see in the progress monitoring that your child is not making enough progress on each IEP goal, or is regressing in some skills or not improving, you should consider whether adjustments need to be made to the IEP, whether it's the type of instruction, whether it's the materials or the accommodations being provided, or even to the goal itself. And you do not have to wait for an annual IEP meeting to do so. You should request in writing if you see that your child's not making meaningful progress based on these reports. You can request an IEP team to convene to review what changes may or may not need to be made. The next slide is importance of documentation. So we've been talking today in this presentation about educational records that the school has issued to you. These are all important educational records. These are important documents. Like Scott said earlier, it's important to review them, to try to understand them, to ask questions about them, and to the extent that you can, try to save them, and either in print or electronically in case you ever need to refer to them in the future. Additionally, there are times where you as the parent may want to create kind of your own documentation, or almost a paper trail or a chronology of events that have occurred, or communications between the parents and school that may occur in person or on the phone, and you think the school is not going to document those things. So some examples of when you may want to create your own documentation, and that could be through a confirming email or a letter. Some examples would be, let's say you provide reports to the school regularly about bullying or harassment that your child is suffering at school. You certainly want to put that in writing. We don't know if the school is keeping record of that, and it's something that you may want in writing later, that the school acknowledge that the school was aware of it at the time and that you were reporting it, and certain events that may happen after. You can also report to your school if you're seeing increasing anxiety symptoms or disengagement of your child in school, or ongoing challenges with homework. If you're constantly telling the teacher and having communications with the teacher about these concerns, It's best to document them just in order to create a chronology, and also if a due process hearing should arise, it helps you in recalling past events. It also provides clarity of what has been communicated and will reduce the likelihood of miscommunication or misunderstandings in the future. Any type of detailed documentation or emails provide a clear picture regarding kind of the nature and progression of how an educational dispute may have arose in the school's efforts to address the problems as they occur. So it's great to just, if you get off the phone with the teacher and she's reported numerous behaviors that are occurring in the classroom and you're not getting any physical document actually reporting that, just send a confirming email to the teacher saying, this is the fifth day this month that you've called me about this concern with so-and-so, with my child's behaviors, and put it in writing. Just be aware that any email that you send confirming some of these events, they may be used later in a future due process hearing. So be aware of your demeanor, your tone. You want to seem cooperative, at least as reflected in the email. Also be sure not to delete any of the emails that you use as confirming documentation of some of these events. Also, another point, if you share an outside report with the school at an IEP meeting, it's important, or just in person at any point, it's important to document that. And you could just do that by sending an email to the school as well, with a copy of the report, so that 6 months later, there's not a question as to whether or not the evaluation was shared with the school.
Okay, so on this subject, emails and texts, in the older days, it was more letters. Obviously, it's more emails, and more recently texts that are the communication vehicle, beyond just speaking to somebody, speaking to a teacher, speaking to somebody else at the school. And I echo what Christine said, just be careful, be cautious, and deliberate in terms of what you write. You may have a good relationship, you have a great relationship with a special education teacher. They're caring and passionate about working with your child, but there still may be issues in the program. And don't feel like, let me say it this way, you're the best advocate for your child. You as parents and guardians, you're the best advocate. And you saying your concern, you saying your observation in an email or a text, and asking for some type of action or decision, that's all absolutely appropriate and legitimate. It's not going to get anybody in trouble. It's not going to, it's not going to suggest that the person is doing a bad job. Say what you need to say. Just be careful how you say it. The documentation is really important, because, as Christine mentioned, going back a year and a half, 2 years, you may not remember the sequence. The teacher may not remember the sequence. The documentation doesn't tell the story, but helps tell the story. We are seeing more and more text communications that are, they're produced as evidence, frankly, in due process hearings, but they're the form of communication back and forth. I would just encourage everybody, just be careful there too, because with text, people tend to maybe let the guard down a little bit. They're more abbreviated. They don't give the full description, a full statement. And sometimes they mix in other types of communication. So just be careful how you write that. And if you can retain your communications, it really helps. It will help you. It will help if you have an advocate or a lawyer, it will help them too. Be clear and precise in what you write. It's usually a good idea. I try to tell myself this all the time. Don't write when I'm upset. Don't write an email when I'm being, if I'm going to be reactionary. And just really be clear and precise and think about what you're going to write. If that requires you to go back and rewrite something, take out a sentence, it's better to do that and not fire it off. Just take your time. The third bullet is make sure that you document I put in big stuff, what is most important. Christine and I talked about this, and just the examples we see are, what is most important that you want to document. Things like, my child is not making progress. I may have said it 50 times at a meeting. I may have said it informally to the teacher, but it's important that I document that. Say that in a writing, and it's okay to say it multiple times in a writing. Second, my child needs more intensive instruction. Then you're talking about, is my child getting enough, good, intensive special education services and instruction? And if you don't think that's the case, say it at the meeting, say it at an IEP meeting, but say that in your written communication. If you're going to request an evaluation, in writing is the way to do it. If you're going to request an independent educational evaluation, and IEE in writing is the way to do it. And if you're going to request copies of your educational records, and we have a slide a little bit further under what's called FERPA, do that in writing. Make it clear. I'm asking for my educational records. Here's the date I'm asking. Here's what I'm asking for. And then you have clarity if you do these things. And if the school doesn't fulfill what you're asking for, at least just you can say, I asked for it, and then you can take it from there in terms of trying to navigate that issue and trying to get what you asked for. So emails and texts, really important. The next slide, and just, I know we're at about an hour, so Benita, we're gonna speed this up a little bit, and we'll obviously stick around for questions. Next slide is report cards. Biggest thing with report cards is they're not good indicators of special education educational related progress. They can be very misleading. Oftentimes, you'll see grades, and the grades aren't meaningful because the grades themselves are not tied to any standards that relate to your child. They're not tied to your child's goals and achievement on the goals. They may not even be tied to general education, classroom instruction. So if you see a report card, certainly read it, consider it, but the progress reporting on goals, if it's done properly, is the far better measure of whether or not your child is making progress. If you get a report card and you're at a parent-teacher conference, it's certainly fine to say, my child got a B. What does a B mean in your class? What does a B mean as far as my child? What did my child have to do to achieve that B? And how does that B compare to when you're saying my child's not making progress on the reading decoding goals? So trying to put the pieces together. Beware of grade inflation by schools, whether it's intentional or unintentional, not characterizing motives, but it happens a lot with report cards. And then just think about what you're going to rely on. Rely on progress reporting, rely on your evaluation report, your standardized achievement testing. We're going to get the FBAs and other information. There's some good scientific type of analysis that are performed at times. So rely on the good information and just consider, but be careful over relying on report cards.
The next slide is attendance records. Just schools are responsible for monitoring and maintaining accurate records of attendance of all enrolled students. So school attendance records will document your child's absences, full day or partial day from school. Scott and I are seeing more and more that information about a student's attendance or non-attendance at school are being included in the IEP present education levels, especially post-COVID. We've been seeing it a lot. And many of the schools are using that information to actually place blame on the student for their own lack of progress. So as a parent, there are many times where your child may be absent because of reasons related to a disability, medical reasons, school anxiety, school bullying incidents. In the virtual hybrid environment, there were many technological issues or barriers that prevented school children from participating. If these are the reasons for your child's excessive absences, best practice would be for the parent to make sure the school knows of those reasons for the absence and ask the school to convene or reconvene an IEP team to discuss those reasons, the impact it's having on your child, and if there are ways to improve your child's attendance. It's very important that that's documented, any of those strategies in the IEP or shared in the parental concerns section. We have a slide on COVID compensatory services as an educational record, really just the agreement or release we wanted to talk about today. COVID compensatory services, according to the PDE, are services that are determined by the IEP team that are needed to remedy the student's lack of progress in a skill or behavior that occurred during the extended school closure during COVID. So now maybe the time your school may be collecting data to make a determination of whether your child is owed these COVID compensatory services. We would just caution you to be aware of if the school presents you with some type of agreement or release to sign in order to accept those services, you really want to be very careful not to waive any past claims or past entitlements or rights. And if you don't understand what you're signing, you may need to have at least a lawyer or someone look at it that understands what the release language may mean. More likely than not, we're seeing that schools may not be offering parents an adequate amount of compensatory services to compensate them for what was lost during COVID. And you don't want to waive your rights to potentially 2 years of compensatory education for the minimal amount of COVID compensatory services that might be offered.
All right, next up is functional behavioral assessment, oftentimes referred to as an FBA. In the IEP, if you look a couple pages in, there's a page titled Special Considerations. One of the questions there is, I'm summarizing, but does your child have interfering behaviors? So behaviors that interfere with their ability to receive instruction in school. And interfering behaviors, certainly it could include more severe behaviors. You can see in the slide examples: physical aggression, verbal aggression, vocalizations, elopement, self-injurious acts, but also things like non-compliance with directives, non-compliance with classroom routines, distractibility, lack of attention. These are all different forms of behavior. And in simple terms, if there are interfering behaviors that are occurring, and if you as an IEP team, you check the behavior box, is what we call it in the IEP, then you need to have a functional behavioral assessment done, and you need to have it done properly. And in my view, a functional behavioral assessment should be done by a board certified behavioral analyst, a BCBA. Districts have BCBAs, many have them on staff or they contract with them. They are trained to properly conduct FBAs. FBA is more scientific and less less certainly academic and less purely educational. So you want it done properly, because if you do an FBA, you're going to identify the behaviors of concern. You identify what's called the antecedents, the triggers, and then come up with a positive behavior plan, a positive behavior support plan to address the behaviors. And when I say address the behaviors, really that means trying to reduce the behaviors and ultimately trying to extinguish the behaviors. But this slide is a brief summary of what an FBA is. Systematic process, important, identifies interfering behaviors, predicts occurrence and non-occurrence of those behaviors based on history and good data taken by the BCBA during an observation. And the process, and as I mentioned, involves observation, not just in one classroom, but across school settings, different days, different areas of the school, different classes. It involves interviews with school staff. It involves interviews with the student often, interviews with you as a parent, and then critically, analysis of the data collected. That's going to drive the results of the FBA. If done properly, it should result in a solid positive behavior support plan, which leads us to the next slide. The positive behavior support plan it's a part of the IEP. So think about this: you check behaviors under special considerations in the IEP. Probably you're going to have a behavioral goal or multiple behavioral goals, because behavior is an area of need for your child. And then you're going to have a plan with tools within that plan to address the behaviors in a comprehensive, consistent, cohesive way. And that's what the positive behavior support plan is. It needs to be part of the IEP. It should not be separate from the IEP. It includes ways to intervene to address behaviors that interfere with learning. It should be developed by the IEP in conjunction with your BCBA, in conjunction with you as a parent. It should include all the needed supports. And again, there's a lot of different ways to address behaviors properly, but it should include the necessary supports to help reduce and then extinguish behaviors. And, it should address it in a way that's measurable. And usually that is, we have a plan, we have goals, so we can tell if this interfering behavior is decreasing over time based on certain conditions. And you can, I think Christine gave an example. That's one where it is good to know if there's progress being made more frequently, whether it's, biweekly or monthly, and getting good information and even considering at times data. And then just the last comment with positive behavior support plan, I can tell you I've been at IEP meetings with Benita many times where we're talking about getting the plan in place, but having the team be able to know what the plan says and then implement the plan, the behavior plan efficiently and with integrity and fidelity. And that oftentimes requires training. So in your IEP, there's going to be a section called supports for school personnel. And that's where the team can be trained on the plan, positive behavior support plan. And then a month later, there can be fidelity checks to see, are they implementing the plan properly? Is it what, or are you getting the information, then assessing the data? And that can be spread out over time. So training is usually a very important part of creation and implementation of a positive behavior support plan.
Okay, disciplinary records. Not going to spend too much time on this today. Tanya did a great job last week of going over all the disciplinary procedures. Just want you to have a general awareness that if your child is subject to disciplinary procedures, a school record should exist. Incident reports are forms in which a school documents the incident or the violation of the school conduct code. It provides witness testimonies and consequences for the misbehaviors. You're entitled to inspect and request copies of disciplinary records. Disciplinary notices are provided for suspensions and expulsions, and there's different procedural safeguards that you should be aware of, that if you are subject to discipline, that you should receive. Additionally, if your child has an IEP and you are subject to a disciplinary change of placement that occurs, which could be 10 consecutive days of being suspended or 15 days cumulatively in a school year, that's considered a change of placement on the next day that the student is suspended. And the parent, and the relevant members of the IEP team are required to conduct a review of the incident to determine if the conduct violation was directly and substantially related to that student's disability, or if the conduct was a direct result of the school's failure to implement your IEP or positive behavior support plan. You will see a manifestation determination worksheet that kind of works through that process, and based on what decision is made, whether the behavior was a manifestation of the student's disability, then certain procedures follow from that team decision. It's important that if your child has been disciplined, though, you read all papers and documents that the school sends you. You make sure you know about meetings or hearings that are scheduled concerning your child. You do not sign or agree to anything you do not understand. And if you're presented with anything, whether at a meeting at school, ask for the opportunity to review it. At home, give yourself the time to process what you're being asked to sign, or get a legal advice on what you're signing under these disciplinary procedures, and attend all meetings and hearings that are scheduled, and take good notes. And then the final slide is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. This is referred to as FERPA. This is a federal law that you should know about that deals with students' educational records. It allows parents the right to inspect and review your child's educational records that are maintained by the school. So a lot of the records we talked about today. The law generally gives the school 45 days after your request for your child's educational records to present the file to you, although a lot of schools do that quicker than 45 days. And if you have an IEP meeting coming up, or you're preparing for a due process hearing, the school is required to provide them sooner. You may also ask for copies of your child's educational records, and depending on your school that your child attends, you may be charged for copying costs unless you're unable to pay the fee. FERPA allows you to ask the school officials to take wrong information out of the file, or ask that it be corrected. And there are procedures in place under FERPA that follow once you make that request of the school. If they refuse, you can have a hearing and have a hearing officer decide whether that correction should be made. FERPA also provides students the right to have their school files kept confidential, and there's a number of provisions in place as to who may or may not be shown your child's file, and when a parent's written permission to release certain information needs to be obtained before a record can be shared with someone else.
So we wanted to say thank you. I know we're going to have a question and answer session. We covered a lot. We appreciate going over an hour a little bit. what we're trying to do, what we tried to do is give you good practical information in addition to, these are the educational forms that you're going to see most frequently. But, it's an ongoing process of learning and awareness. Take advantage of your resources, take advantage of the ARC of Philadelphia. They do a tremendous job. And, if you need other support there, I think there's other support out there also. So thank you on behalf of Christine and I for listening, and, fire away with questions.
All right, Scott, I've been gathering some questions. One parent asked, where can we find a list of all the things